Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. So why don't we start right in where Margaret left off, and I'll start with you, Melissa. There was a lot of conventional wisdom during the campaign that Donald Trump could not be president because he was going to get creamed among female voters. In fact, he won 53% of white women voters, and I think 62%, close to two-thirds, of white working-class women voters. So why was the conventional wisdom so wrong?
So I live in North Carolina. I had long been predicting that Mr. Trump was going to win the presidency. I'd actually had a great deal of difficulty actually placing a piece suggesting that on the site that I write for. I think in part because, and I understand if I were an editor, I probably also would not have published it. But for me, the conventional wisdom, if that's in fact what it is, ought to have suggested that about 50-some% of white women were going to vote for Mr. Trump because they vote for the Republican Party consistently. So 53% of white women voting for the Republican candidate is not at all unheard of. If you lived in North Carolina and many other places, you would see that really ordinary people were going to vote for Mr. Trump. What I don't like is an analysis that suggests that all Trump voters were these sort of three-headed persons. As soon as you lived in a place where, when you went to the grocery store or the gas station, your friends and colleagues who you know and spend time with had Trump stickers, you're like, oh, I see. Normal people are going to vote for Mr. Trump. And once you realize that, then you could have expected, I think, or begun to realize that we were in a more normal election cycle than you might otherwise have expected. Under those circumstances, for me, then the key was going to be, as it had been in 2008 and 2012, African-American women voters. And in fact, I think when we look at it, the drop-off is really about not the percentage of African-American women voters who gave their votes to Hillary Clinton, because, again, we overwhelmingly showed up for her, but the percentage of the overall electorate that we were. And so we made up a smaller proportion of the electorate, suggesting that there was either suppression or potentially in addition to somewhat less enthusiasm about Hillary Clinton's campaign. And I suggest actually probably those two things went together. There was somewhat less enthusiasm, a little less effort to get out black women's votes, and of course suppression efforts in a variety of the states where we could have made a difference, North Carolina being one of them.
And before we go to the other two panelists, can I just ask you a little more about that, about the lack of enthusiasm? What do you think explains the lack of enthusiasm?
Well, so in both 2008 and 2012, African-American women's overwhelming support for President Obama, and again, not just the percent support, but the percent of the electorate that we made up, was historic, right? We outperformed every other race, gender, demographic, despite the fact that we have less educational attainment, less income, all the other things that ought to be related to, that are correlated with voter turnout. So we overcame every single barrier. So under what circumstances does a population overcome every single barrier in order to turn out to vote? So I think in 2008 and 2012, there are a number of extremely important symbolic and substantive reasons that black women show up for the Obamas, both Barack and the First Lady. For me, when I look at the Clinton campaign, there were a number of missed opportunities, both in the campaign, but also in the party more broadly. So, for example, I think the failure to nominate an African-American woman for the Supreme Court is one. I think if an African-American woman nominee had been languishing in the way that, for example, our Attorney General had been languishing, if you look at what happened around Loretta Lynch, when it became a kind of count every single day, sisters were not having it. Black women showed up. It became very clear that Loretta Lynch's nomination and her confirmation depended in part on black women's ability to show up and show out. So I think if black women had understood and believed and had on the line, for example, an African-American woman Supreme Court nominee who would not have been confirmed, would have been languishing in the same way that Garlic Marin was, but not just sort of the court is at stake, but this woman is at stake. That is, for example, one way in which the Obama administration might have helped in this effort to make sure that whomever the Democratic nominee was would have had that kind of effort. I think the ways in which, for example, the Mothers of the Movement were used in sort of rooms here and there, they were traveling around, but they weren't on urban radio. They weren't part of a national television campaign. The fact that the Clinton campaign had extraordinary African-American women working for it, but they weren't forefronted. Unless you were an insider, you didn't know about these women. So I think that there were a number of ways, again, in which it was as though no one inside of the party understood how to run a crosstab. They kept talking about women voters. It's not women who vote for the Democratic Party, it's black women.
Totally fascinating. Jen, a lot was made of the fact that Hillary Clinton emphasized the historic nature of her candidacy more this time around than she had in 2008. Do you think that ultimately mattered? Did it help her? Did it hurt her? Did it both help and hurt her? Or was ultimately, did that decision ultimately end up being irrelevant to the outcome?
Well, I think with all things in this election, there's not one simple yes or no answer to this. I think that it is certainly it was important for her to acknowledge that she was a woman running for office. I think that it was much more important for her to do it this cycle than I think probably she felt comfortable doing or was able to do in 2008. There is no doubt that there are many, many millions of women that really responded to that. And that was powerful and impactful. But at the same time, she was walking a tightrope to make sure that she didn't emphasize that too much or too little, that she had the right calibration no matter who she was talking to. And I think, the broader problem here is that gender is still a problem when you're running for office and leadership. And I think that, we are seeing both men and women are still not as comfortable as Hillary Clinton needed them to be president and to run for president, to show the ambition that she wanted to become and should be president. We all well know, of course, here in this room that, when Hillary Clinton and other women are in office, their favorability is much higher than when they're running. And so, I think that sort of unpacks a lot of challenges that we continue to face. I think certainly the Clinton campaign made a lot of mistakes. Every campaign makes a lot of mistakes. It's always, President Obama's campaign, which, I was on, we made a lot of mistakes too, but we don't have to talk about that as much because we won, which I'm glad about. But, the reality is there's a lot that they could control as a campaign that, you could point to several areas that, maybe they could have done better. There's a lot that they couldn't control, and there's a lot that they just had to be perfect on. And the reason they had to be perfect was because she was a woman, and that carried through for every aspect of what that campaign did.
Can you say a little bit more about the dynamics involved in women, some women, also, in addition to, like men, being more resistant to women in power, and why does that tend to subside once they actually hold the job, which is why do people become more approving of women when they actually wield power than when they're seeking power?
Well, I'm a campaign strategist, so there are people that could speak much deeper to. You yourself had a great piece on talking about this. I think fundamentally the answer that the campaign had to address was how to talk to women. And women are not one group. We're saying women, they're not monolithic. And at the end of the day, part of what we as campaign strategists in the Clinton campaign needed to think about is how do you engage two people, including women, and have a two-way conversation and really identify what matters. How do you want to engage? How do you want to be part of this? And build that framework to wrap around people so that they can participate and break down some of the barriers that still exist. We know absolutely that there are many people that said after the election, I wish I was more public with my support for Hillary Clinton, but they didn't feel that comfortable. Or they would say, I support Hillary Clinton, but. President Obama broke past that, and you couldn't turn around in most places, even in many of the areas that Hillary Clinton lost, without seeing great support. So that all these layers overlap into each other. But I think one of the things in 2012 we really tapped in on was people working their own networks and being able to reach out beyond, beyond what the campaign was doing to say to their friends and family, I support President Obama, here's why, you should too, here's how I'm volunteering. And I think there was a level of that was lost. And part of that is because I think there's still some traditional norms that exist in this country that women and men feel. I remember when I first worked in politics, my mom said, well, your candidate just doesn't look as presidential as this older white fellow. And my mother is as liberal as they come, but there's a baked-in level of this that I think that we needed to be very deliberate about, and some of that is to build the personal connections there that I think perhaps is where we miss around the edges in some instances on the campaign.
Margie, there was this period in the campaign when the Access Hollywood tape came out, and then woman after woman was coming forward about things that they said Donald Trump had done. And I mean, there were even a moment when, prominent Republicans were saying that Donald Trump should actually get off the ticket. It was that level of feeling like this was the end for his campaign. The media played the story very, very big, understandably, and yet it turned out not to be as big a deal politically as I certainly thought it would be, and it seemed like even a lot of Republicans thought it would be. I wonder if you can try to talk a little bit about why this turned out not to be as important as people thought it would be.
Yeah, I mean, it was supposed to be the year we tried to decide if we were ready for a woman president, and instead we decided we were ready for an admitted sexual abuser to be president, and that's clearly, that's what was so. One of the many insane things of this election was that week where people thought, okay, well, this is truly the last straw. And it, in fact, it just reflected what was already a calcified image of him. It was not a surprise to folks to see that Trump behaved in a boorish way in private as he had in public. And I think for a lot of people, I guess I would say a couple things. Just like we don't know how much of support or a lack of support for Clinton had to do with gender and how much of it is because of something else, partisanship or something specific about her as a candidate. That's an academic question that is not so clear-cut. It's not 100% is sexism. It's not 0%. Just like we don't know for Trump, how much is the acceptance of some of these really very unusual behaviors that he demonstrated over the course of the campaign, how much is it because people liked it, they appreciate it, how much is because he was an entertainer, so they had a different filter, they had a different lens through which they looked at him. You saw in the exit polls, 2/3 of folks who voted said that he didn't have the right temperament, 2/3 said he didn't have the right experience, 1/5 of those voted for him anyway. So there were some who said, I know that he's flawed, I'm doing it anyway, for a variety of reasons. They all have, there are a variety of different reasons, but there are folks who voted for him anyway, and there are folks who enjoy that aspect. So there are both. I think that we saw, and this is true of women and men, this is not specific to men, that there was this acceptance of Trump's behavior because they liked some other piece of what he was offering. Change, something new, willingness to do something, unusual, sort of drain the swamp, blow things up, that people appreciated or at least found refreshing. And that was true for both women and men. It was no surprise to women in our focus groups that men behaved badly. And just like there was no surprise to men. And you saw that in the polling where there was some division. It really depended on how you asked it. Did you think it was, did people think it was sort of normal behavior? Did they approve of it? Those are different kinds of questions. Did they think it was going to hurt him in his campaign? Well, you get a different answer. So it really depended on how people were asked about it, the frame that people used. And I think in the end, you had so many other big events leading up to the election, whether the Comey letter, the debate, that all happened after the Access Hollywood tapes, that receded into the background, amazingly. So I think that for when we think about the election and think about how we talk about Trump and his views toward women or his views toward race, that the more, it's a theory that potentially there's some research for, that the more you push and emphasize how extreme he is, the more some of his supporters dig into the belief that that's okay. They're less likely to move. So there was some preliminary research at the University of Maryland. This was on race, not on gender, where they did an experiment, and calling out Trump's views on race did nothing to change the views of whites, not liberal whites, but whites who were harboring a bit of racial resentment. Didn't move them at all. That this circling and highlighting and underlining of racism and sexism does not move people, because people say, well, I kind of support how Trump feels about X, Y, and Z. Are you saying that I'm racist, or are you saying that I'm sexist? And that people want to dig in their heels a little bit. So I think some of that was happening too. So there were, it was not inconsistent with how they viewed him. There were a lot of other things that happened after that moment, headed into the election. And for some voters, it was, they didn't want to be called, painted with the same brush that people were painting Trump. So I think all of those things were contribute to why Access Hollywood tapes weren't in the end disqualifying.
Melissa, you're a professor. You spend a lot of time with young people. So I'm really interested to know, what has been the impact on the young women who you teach of this failure to have this breakthrough, and to have someone with the record of Donald Trump, multiple accusations of sexual assault, to be our president? And I'm equally interested, what's been the reaction, what's been the impact, what's been the reaction among young men?
Sure. So I was truly privileged all year to lead a program called Wake the Vote. We had 30 students, Democrats and Republicans, who had a very intense experience traveling together. We call it Iowa to the inauguration, so we're not quite done. We will be back here in a month. And they worked together in Iowa and New Hampshire, both South Carolina primaries, North Carolina. We went to both Cleveland and Philadelphia together. They did 90 hours of campaign work over the course of the summer, and then a ton of get out the vote and voter work in North Carolina over the course of the fall. And these students, I think, in fact, I'm quite sure, were quite deeply invested in the campaign. That said, they also had to listen to me over the course of it, and I think I probably have a somewhat different take on a lot of these questions, in part because I do stand at the intersectional space of being an African-American woman and a scholar of African-American feminism, of Black feminism, and therefore rarely do things like say race or gender, because I live them both and study them both simultaneously. So for example, I am not even vaguely surprised by the idea that sexual assault would be a not disqualifier for the American presidency. In fact, was mostly irritated every time people would say, oh God, we can't have a racist be the American president, because I kept wondering since when. In fact, for most of American history, racism has been a prerequisite to win the American presidency. One had to actually demonstrate one's racism in order to become the American president. And the same was certainly true of sexism and even of sexual assault. Well, I certainly don't want to make any parallelism between pussy grabbing and the behavior of actually I want to make some parallelism. I want to call it maybe just 1.5 standard deviations worse. But I do want to just remind us that at the beginning of this election cycle, the Anita Hill story was returned to us as a topic of political discourse. We marked it. And that the marking of the Anita Hill story and the confirmation of Clarence Thomas reminds us that despite his current stance on the question of sexual assault, that Joe Biden participated as a member of the Senate Confirmation Committee in a kind of discursive violence against a Black woman's body in a deeply distressing space, so much so that it became the initiation more than 20 years ago of the Year of the Woman for women running for office. And while he is certainly not that dude anymore in public space, quite the opposite, he's also never picked up the phone and frickin' apologized to Professor Hill, which couldn't possibly be that hard to do. And so our willingness to be forgetful I'll also remind us that this is a country whose media, which was all up in arms about pussy grabbing, had basically no coverage of the Daniel Holtzclaw case. An officer who systematically sexually assaulted and raped black women in this country. I will remind you that in this country, just prior to the election, MSNBC brought a certified liar back to air and sat him next to a Rhodes Scholar, so that every single debate, you saw a brilliant woman next to a sort of dude, so that your nightly news was brought to you by the thing that your debate was. So we are actually primed by the things that we see to not be particularly concerned. On the liberal side, on the conservative side, about the violence against women's bodies. And so what I will say is, my students are appalled, they're harmed, they're hurt, they're in pain, they have angst, but they also have me as their professor. So I am constantly trying to put these things in historical context for them, which I think maybe is just more hurtful and painful, but hopefully also will turn them into brave warrior princesses.
That's great. We have just a few minutes for questions, so maybe I can just take a couple. People are walking around with microphones. Go ahead, I see a hand in the way back there.
One of the things that I'm surprised that I haven't heard, which seems to me obvious, is that at this point in America, no woman could be elected president. And I think that's the reality. I don't think you could take Mother Teresa, Einstein, and Angela Merkel and put them all in one body and she could get elected in America.
I think Ivanka Trump's got a good shot in 8 years.
No, seriously. If you can seriously address that, I think it would be worth it.
Jen, Margie?
I mean, that's not what people like to believe about themselves. We have Americans have an aspiration to want to be able to vote for a woman. Now, we don't know. We only have an N of one, really, in terms of, a nominee, I should clarify. So it's hard to know. But it does, at least at the very bare minimum, reflect that people feel at least the social pressure to say that they'd be open to voting for a woman. And that's different. That's changed over decades. So now you have a record number of people, 80% of people saying that they'd vote for a woman, that America's ready to vote for a woman. You have similar numbers. You also have about same numbers say that there'll be a woman who will be president in their lifetime. And a couple different polls have shown that. So whether or not that's true is hard to know it in the abstract, but we can know with some certainty that people want to believe about themselves, that their support for Clinton or lack of support for Clinton had nothing to do about their gender. That's going to be true for some people. It's not going to be true for everybody, and that we're going to have to we can take some people at their word that they are open and want to vote for a woman. So that's at least some good news going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also add, we did see some amazing women win this cycle, and I think that's really important to remember and to highlight. Across the country, women of color, women in the Senate, that are really going to be pushing the boundaries. Now they're going to be doing it from the minority, unfortunately, but I think that we have a much broader playing field when we think about young women and women from diverse backgrounds that are representing us. So I think it's incumbent on us to really figure out where they won, what happened. Places like Nevada and California and New Hampshire, and really spend some time thinking about that. And this isn't all about tactics, but it's certainly about what was done differently and how did they break through. And so my belief is that yes, today I'm not hopeful that there is the perfect path for a woman to run in 2020, that we won't be up against the same thing, but at the same time, I think there's still key elements underneath the surface here that have strong women leaders that were elected in big races that we can't forget.
Well, on that hopeful note, we're going to hand it off to the next panel. I want to thank Melissa Harris-Perry, Jen O'Malley Dillon, and Margie Omero. Thank you very much.